All right, and now we are very pleased to have another friend of Psymposia, Neşe, who recently got her doctorate in, what is the technically in comparative literature, but really it was a study of the history of psychedelic literature in the past centuries, which is fascinating because whenever you have some person who tells you, listen, I know the first person to do this, or I was the first person to do this, there's always somebody before them. And once you start reading the literature, you find out humans have been tripping ever since before we ever left the plains of Africa. And so she dug into all the old stories of all the old trippings we did and saw how we did it. And so now, one of her stories from her adventures.
Hey guys. It's nice to talk here. Actually, the only reason I got my PhD studying psychedelic literature is because of Horizons. It was 5 years ago in 2010, I came to my first conference. It was my second year of my PhD program. And I knew I had all these personal interests in psychedelics, but I thought I had to keep that under wraps. But I walked into Horizons and I saw that there was this movement in academia to actually bring these conversations back into open, above board scholarship. And I realized there's no reason that this should stay just in science. And so I decided I was gonna, do my own psychedelic studies in a literature field. And Penn's literature program is in the top 5 in the country. It's an Ivy League. They were extremely supportive of me. I recently got a graduate teaching award out of something like 600 nominations. They gave 10 awards, and they awarded me for teaching psychedelic literature classes because the students were so happy with the... So I'm not going to be talking about my stories tonight, just talking about other people's stories. The book that I'm working on that comes out of my dissertation research is called Chemical Poetics, the Literary History of Psychedelic Science. So I'm not studying, there's a psychedelic literature that's trippy, that kind of has a psychedelic aesthetic to it, but I'm specifically looking at trip reports and the literary history of trip reports and that process of how people convey unprecedented experiences in language and the way that they can communicate it to other people. Because language is designed as something that's between people to describe things out in the world. And so if you have an experience, in some cases like if Shulgin invents a chemical, nobody in the history of humanity has ever tried that chemical before. So there's no pre-existing language to convey the content of that experience. And so I just became interested in the way that poetry, creative uses of language, and metaphor are really central to psychedelic science research. And this is something that I think we should talk more about, because the language of science cannot capture the full extent of the psychedelic experience and what's going on there. It's one paradigm, and it's one paradigm that does a lot, but it definitely doesn't do everything. So in this past year, the New York Public Library a few years ago acquired most of Timothy Leary's archive. I spent the entire month of August taking photographs. I took 20,000 photographs of documents, and I only got through 1/10 of the total materials they have available. He kept absolutely everything. There's the original Concord prison experiment trip reports. There's correspondence between all of the, kind of mostly founding fathers of psychedelic science. And so I found this interesting correspondence between Leary and Gerald Hurd, dated April 10th, 1961. And he said, this is Leary writing, "At the height of the mystical experience, communication is unnecessary and indeed impossible." And this reminds me of Aldous Huxley's line that trying to get people to answer questions about tripping when they're at the height of their trip is sort of like trying to give a questionnaire to someone who's making love. It just doesn't really go with the experience. And so I said, one of the great challenges in our research is after communication. How can we describe it? The limitations of scientific prose become so apparent. My experience with psychedelics has made me less satisfied with the abstract and general terms and more comfortable with terms which are concrete, specific, and personal. In writing up our research, I've been experimenting with new modes of communication. The results, as expected, vary in effectiveness, but there's reward in the trying. So here you see psychedelics are actually operating as a catalyst for the evolution of language, which is in turn the evolution of consciousness. It pushes the boundaries of what we can say, what we can think, and what we can communicate. So one of those experimental descriptions is in this other letter I found. This letter is from Leary to the poet George Andrews, a beat poet, and while George was living in Tangiers, Morocco. This is dated 1st of May, 1962, so after that other letter I just read. So Leary writes, "Dear George, your letter arrived out of a clear blue sky, like a bolt. How on earth can I answer your question? And what does it mean if I tell you that I've seen the beginning in a mushroom vision, capital B beginning, by the way, where there are all kinds of strange things going on and very different to what we read about in history books? However, I shall attempt an answer of sorts. In the beginning, all was static. The earth was neither fire nor solid. It was a drop of water on someone's kitchen table, an instant between the action of spilling and some future cleaning up. Or perhaps the earth is a barnacle on a rock, formed between two waves, an event of no significance then, created in a vacuum between the ebb and the flow of some unthinkable, unimaginable sea. And man evolved in 1/1000th of a second, still less will he disappear. And then another wave will sweep across the rock, and another barnacle will be created that is also the center of a universe. But what strange events took place in this 1/1000th of a second? Cities were built in the image of the human cortex. Religions were invented to explain the kitchen table. The stars are the reflection of distant electric light bulbs. Tangiers is the figment of your imagination. Mushrooms are eternally high. Times Square is a grain of sugar on a plastic hardtop. We are in a cave of shadows, a subway ride with other shadows for company. And at any minute we can decide to leave the cave, come out into the sunshine of another existence that dazzles our eyes. But who will believe us when, upon our return to the cave, we tell of another world far more real in its magnificence than the accustomed half-light we call the shadow earth? Here, then, is part of the Platonic parable, which you must read. It is one of the best metaphorical descriptions of man in a state of expanded awareness, of his difficulties to communicate to his fellow man what he has seen beyond the cave, and of his joy, despair, and amazement at all of this. You will find it in the 7th book of Plato's Republic. Hastily and with warmest regards, yours ever, Timothy Leary." So you see this sort of like creative, poetic language. And I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I read a trip report and I just get these tingles. You know, someone writes something and I'm like, whoa, like I feel that. Like someone just experienced something and put it in language in a way that isn't just telling me about it, it's helping me feel what that person was experiencing. And so you fast forward to the early 90s when Anne and Sasha Shulgin wrote Pikal. And you have Sasha Shulgin was describing Aleph 1 when he was self-administering and testing it. And he said, you know, rather than try to remember and describe after the fact what happened, in this case, he did decide to write during the experience. And he has, you know, he starts out very measured, you know, slight alteration to vision, that kind of thing. But then as you go on with the time markers, the language gets more and more far out, more and more philosophical, more and more experimental, until you get to something like this. If all this is in all of us, it must be everywhere in the galaxy. And if nonverbal insight can be triggered chemically, then its chemistry must be universal, intergalactic, the infinitely effective catalyst. This is the truly intergalactic communication, by chemistry, not radio or light or X-rays or binary codes, chemistry. And he leaves that there. He says, maybe a scientist might say that's not the most objective language to be using, but that's data from the experience. The poetry that results from these altered states is the scientific data that we're working with in a lot of cases. And so it makes sense to have, because I was actually working with the NYU study that was looking at the transcripts of people who are describing their life-changing psilocybin experiences. And so, you know, having medical people come together with literary scholars and all the rest to kind of collaborate and try to unearth, like, what the heck are we dealing with here? Like, none of us individually knows. So it's this, you know, communal project of collaboration and exploration. So I'll just end with another quote from Anne Shulgin, describing, you know, one of her altered states of consciousness. And you can see how language gets tripped out in her attempt to explain something that can't be explained by normal language. From the upper left-hand corner of the universe, there came a greeting from something which had known me, and which I had known since before time and space began. There were no words, but the message was clear and smiling. Hello, dear friend. I salute you with respect, humor, love. It is a pleasure with laughter, joy to encounter you again. Thank you.